don't know if you, like me, have ever read a book or watched a movie and sometime later know that you read that book or watched that movie but can't remember for the life of you really much of what it was about or the point of it at all. And yet, still something sticks out. Maybe it's a character, maybe it's something that was said or a scene or whatever. But I have this with a book that I read, and it's by Judith Guest. It's called Ordinary People, and I can't really remember much about it except this one character. And it's this man, and he's middle-aged, and he cannot figure out who in the world he is as a person. And so every time that he hears a conversation by another person, like in an elevator or a restaurant or whatever, where that person says something like, I'm the type of man who, well, he listens because he's intrigued by these people who know so very fully who they are, and he thinks that they can teach him, whose identity is very much up for grabs, a thing or two. These people who say, I'm the type of a man who never takes no for an answer, or I'm the type of woman who always closes the deal. Whenever someone talks like that about their own identity with such definition, he thinks maybe he could learn something for his own, since his identity is very much mush. It's formless and void. And yet, in time, as he listens to them, he comes to discern that all of that is really just bravado. That in them, it's just a boast, but really deep within, just like him, there's this inner hollowness. In actuality, they don't seem to know themselves any more than he does. They just claim they do. And so what I really remember about this, and almost nothing else, is this guy finally doing this exploration and saying to himself at the end, I'm the kind of guy who hasn't got the foggiest idea what sort of guy I am. Which is sad and kind of pathetic, but it does also beg the question, I think, of us, what sort of people are we? Now, perhaps you've never much thought about that before, never had much cause to, and yet I want to lay out before you today that maybe you should. Because, see, I don't know if you've noticed it, but the very first attack on Jesus, in that wild wilderness that David just read to us about, where all these forces of evil called Satan are conspiring against him, the first attack was an attack on Jesus' basic identity. What sort of guy are you? Probably didn't even notice it. It's very subtle, easily missed, but still there's this deadly taunt that begins each and every temptation. And it starts with one little word, if. If you are the chosen one, if you are the Son of God, Jesus, if you are all that they say that you are, well then command that stone to become a loaf of bread. If. And you heard what's behind that if, right? Maybe it even sounds a bit familiar to you. I mean, granted, probably you don't get too tempted into believing you're the chosen one. At least I hope not. And yet still, the tone of that taunt may remind many of us of voices that come in our lives and in just the living of life. If you are really the right woman for the job, if you're really good enough, if you're really such a great dad, if you're a real man or woman, if. The self-doubt of if, the self-doubt of not knowing what sort of person that you really are. And so in these first words of Satan's, we hear a temptation that many of us might struggle with too. The temptation to constantly feel like we have to prove who we are, our worth, our significance, which many of us feel we have to do quite often because those things might be more than we care to admit, a bit up for grabs. And so here's Jesus, who's just after his baptism, which came immediately before this, where he was proclaimed to be, by the Holy Spirit, God's Son, the beloved, in whom God's well pleased. He tells everyone to listen to him. This is really heady stuff, by the way. And yet, even with him, right along behind it comes these voices that are really evil intending, saying, well, if you really are all that, why don't you go ahead and prove it? But Jesus, knowing who he is, being well-formed as a person, has the good sense to resist that urge, and so in essence just says, nah. Which is really quite interesting, that Jesus is first known to us in Matthew's gospel, not by what he affirms, what he teaches, what he accomplishes, but rather by what he rejects. That is, Jesus is first known to us by his no's, not his nose. What he says no to, he knows who he is enough to know when to say no. So again, these temptations are coming right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It isn't even really started yet. It's the very start, and like all starts, it charts a course, it sets a trajectory. Where's Jesus going to go? Well, let's see. The first thing we know about where Jesus is going to go is where Jesus is not going to go. He must be going that way because he said no to all these three other ways. Or to put it another way, Jesus knows where to go in life because Jesus knows where not to go in life. He knows when to say no because he knows what sort of guy he is. But you say, well, yeah, but he's saying no to evil. And anybody with any sense would say no to evil, to which I would say, well, if you think it's that easy to say no to evil, then you don't know anything about evil. Because evil's rather wily when recognized in the wilderness, maybe even more so when we don't even know evil's name. I mean, consider how sly these temptations really are. He puts a question in Jesus' mind about his identity, and then instead of outright attacking that identity, abusing it, instead he offers Jesus gifts. I don't know if you noticed that, but he offers Jesus gifts. And guess what? The really great gifts, Jesus has to get them in the wrong way. First of all, Satan offers Jesus bread, basic sustenance. And who doesn't need bread? Jesus needs bread. He's hungry. He hasn't eaten for 40 days. Moreover, Jesus lives amongst impoverished, hungry people. They need bread desperately. Stones they got plenty of. And thus Satan encourages Jesus to do something which, by the way, almost certainly every single person in this place today has wondered why God will not do. Why will God not take away all of the hunger and the pain and the need and the anguish in this world in a miraculous moment? I mean, why doesn't God do that? Haven't you ever wondered? As a guy who's spent my entire life trying to reduce the amount of calories I take in and going to a gym in futility to try to burn off what I need to, it was shocking, as I've mentioned many times, the first time that I ever encountered people who were starving, in true need, that were malnourished. And being around them and despairing about my own inability to alone change their situation, I understand this temptation. Every time I hear it, it's all I can think about. Wouldn't it be great if God would just wipe away all that want and need in this world? Why does this world have that? Why doesn't God do that? And so Satan asks Jesus that very question and tempts him just to take care of it. And yet Jesus knows who he is. Jesus has taken some time to learn a thing or two, to search himself out about how hunger, by the way, actually happens in this world, and about what's important in life. And so Jesus knows, first off, that you can have all the resources in this world, it happens all the time, and still have an impoverished, full of famine soul. You can have all the bread in this world, and you're going to just get fat if you never learn to share. Which really is our problem in this world. It's not lack of bread. And so Jesus knows the cure to impoverish hunger in this world isn't a miracle, but a change in the human heart when it comes to sharing the bounty of God's rich creation. But most of all, he knows who he is, and we need more, each and every one of us, and him included as a human being, than just bread alone. He knows he's not the sort of guy who's supposed to live by bread alone, which might sound obvious that we need more than bread, and I don't mean jam and butter. What I'm talking about here is something actually that's not obvious at all, because how tempting it is to spend an entire life precisely working for nothing but bread alone. Happens every day. In fact, I would say it's typical. In fact, I'd go further. If you don't know what sort of person you are, this is almost certainly the sort of person you're going to be. One who gives over your life to nothing more than the pursuit of bread in all of its forms alone. There's probably no temptation to see to do more, and yet Jesus says no. So Satan changes course and offers Jesus another gift, this time power. Now we're talking, right? But Jesus is a harder target than us, so Satan wraps his promise of power to Jesus in the idea that if Jesus would just seize power in this world, then he could then use it for good. Seize it through whatever means you need, ends justify the means, and then use it for good. Now, this makes sense to us because, after all, who would we entrust more with the powers of this world than Jesus? It's a brilliant temptation. Come on, Jesus. It doesn't matter how you get control of this world. Bow down to me and you'll have the kingdoms. Just that you get it instead of those heathen others. It's about playing the game. It's just politics. It's just how it works. You go along to get along. Doesn't matter what you say is true. You just got to win Super Tuesday. It's okay. As long as you get a good Christian like you in control of things around here, who cares at all how it's achieved? I'll compromise anything just to get my person in office. Jesus knows who he is. Jesus knows that the work of God happens always through love, never coercion. And if you don't remember any other theological truth in your life, remember that one. Why does God not coerce the world? Because have you ever heard of anybody being coerced into loving them? Jesus knows that he doesn't need the power of this world to be manipulated as we think that we do, because he knows that there's a power beyond this world. And so Jesus, thank God, is not going to chase the sandcastle kingdoms around here, because after all, he's the type of guy who does not worship or serve any power but God alone. And so Jesus says no. Well, finally, Satan catches on to what sort of guy Jesus really is. And so finally, Satan offers Jesus something he'll surely like: religion. Having failed at bread and power, Satan offers Jesus spiritual show business. Oh, Jesus, he says, just think of all the crowds that will come to see the spectacle that is you. If you just do the really big flashy thing, throw yourself off the temple, let everybody watch the angels come and catch you. Wow, Barnum. Quit worrying about truth and substance and faith. Put everything on the bottom shelf. Don't tell anything that anybody may get mad at, because they're just going to run away to the Methodists. Didn't you hear how they're bringing them in droves in that big church across town? And everybody knows, I mean, if the masses love something in this world, it's got to be important. You know, like The Bachelor. So be important, Jesus. It doesn't matter how you get it done. Just get it done. But Jesus knows who he is. He knows there's something more important than fannies and pews. Because after all, he's the type of guy who would never put God to a popularity test. And so Jesus says no. There's 3 no's that chart a good life's course because Jesus knows who he is. And maybe as much as anything today, it's not that we're going to have the same sorts of temptations, perhaps. Certainly never the same responsibility, but we need to know who we are as well. And learn the lesson from Jesus that if it took time for him to be formed as a person of God, then how do we think that that's something that we can just leave to chance? Jesus certainly didn't. He knew it wasn't going to just happen on its own, and so he was formed and allowed himself to be over time. See, I believe that as important as it was of how Jesus fought against those assaults of Satan, it's when Jesus started fighting against those assaults. See, Jesus started all the way back when he was a little kid, like the little kids right now, in Sunday school here, going to synagogue, learning the Torah, saying his prayers. Jesus started fighting back week after week, month after month, year after year, like you are here today, learning life's lessons in worship and study and the constancy of prayers. And then when the devil came, he said, "It is written." He instinctually knew the scriptures, quoting them, making the devil flee. It is written, it is written, it is written. You see, he took the time to know what is written, and it wrote its way into his very soul and life. It formed him so much so that when it mattered, Jesus knew what sort of guy he was. And I don't want you to make the mistake of believing that the sort of discernment in him was somehow obvious or just common sense. To the contrary, I would argue it was the most uncommon sense ever that he displayed. For when Jesus said those 3 no's, he put himself at odds with the 3 most cherished commodities of this world: possessions, stones in the bread; power, kingdoms of this world; popularity, throw yourself off the temple. Possessions, power, and popularity are what are sought, and people compromise themselves for. They don't know who they are. And yet Jesus knew the right, if not obvious, times to say no in order to yield to God's yes. The question is, what sort of gal or guy are you? And have you learned when to say no in order that God might say yes through your life? And the question is then, where are you learning that? Where is that being formed? Who is whispering in your ear? Because that's not just going to happen. It takes time to be formed. And that's why Jesus asks us to be his followers and not on Facebook. That's why Jesus said to be his disciples and not his political base that likes him on social media. It means to actually follow in his ways and try to be him and like him more and more in the world. And so, I believe that there's a lesson in all of that for you and me. And my prayer this Lent is that we will prove to be the type of guys and gals, the type of people who take the time to learn those lessons. Amen.